This is a locust. A locust is more or less a giant grasshopper. Some version of it exists on every continent except Antarctica. They mostly hang out as innocuous insects, among many others, until they don't. You might remember the plague of locusts as one of the ones visited upon Egypt as they held the Hebrew people as slaves. In reality, a locust plague isn't all that unusual. It's one of those plagues of biblical proportions that just comes around every so often. This has been true for thousands of years and remains true today. So what makes a locust stop being one of those bugs that you don't even know is around and become something that can be called a plague? The answer is the end of a drought. When a drought finally ends and there is rapid growth of vegetation, locusts change their behavior. The same behavior might exist in some other circumstances where things go from brown to very lush and green vegetation, but the most common thing is a drought, then an end to the drought. When vegetation starts to regrow, these locusts get a massive dose of serotonin. And so they start to reproduce in large numbers. They become social with one another. They start to migrate. In other words, the locusts become a swarm of locusts. Once they start swarming, they lay eggs, and the cycle repeats all over again. A large swarm of locusts may contain as many as 150 million critters. With 500,000 of them weighing a metric ton, which is about 2,200 pounds, even a small swarm can be devastating to that new vegetation. That metric ton of locusts, 500,000 of them, eat as much in a single day as 10 elephants, or 25 camels, or 2,500 people. You can imagine what a large swarm, 30 times that size, might do. Once they're done eating in one place, they move on, and as a swarm, they can travel thousands of miles, wreaking havoc along the way. Last year, locusts were one of the threats that was made even worse by COVID-19. Countries in the Horn of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula were especially affected. Burundi, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, South Sudan, and Uganda faced the worst infestations. Kenya's was the worst in 70 years. Yemen, Pakistan, and India and Nepal had their own swarms as well. And in South America, Paraguay and Argentina faced a different type of locust, but they also had the worst outbreak in 60 years. Southern Africa and China have yet a couple more species they're working to keep under control. Locusts still show up around the world, and while we have means of managing them now, they still have the risk of leaving a path of destruction. Like so many things, their threat rises with climate change. ASU happens to be home to the Global Locust Initiative, in case you want to learn more about locusts and the management of them. Now, what on earth does this have to do with Pentecost? At the end of today's reading, Paul quotes the prophet Joel. In the last days, God says, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and your daughters will prophesy, your young will see visions, your elders will dream dreams, even upon my servants, men and women. I will pour out my spirit in those days, and they will prophesy. I will cause wonders to occur in heavens above and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and a cloud of smoke. The sun will be changed into darkness, and the moon will be changed into blood before the great and spectacular day of the Lord comes. and everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Well, you wouldn't know it from that quote. The book of Joel was written after a locust plague. It is not one of those things that is supported by scholarship or you might need other sources to figure out, or only I could tell you because I have the right book. It's literally written in the book of Joel itself. Here are the first 4 verses of that book. The word of the Lord that came to Joel, son of Pethuel. Hear this, you elders. Listen, all who live in the land. Has anything like this ever happened in your days or the days of your ancestors? Tell it to your children, and let your children tell it to their children and their children to the next generation. What the locust swarm has left, the great locusts have eaten. What the great locusts have left, the young locusts have eaten. What the young locusts have left, other locusts have eaten. It's not a metaphor. I know we sometimes think of locusts as a metaphor, but it is not. They have experienced a swarm. Then the repeating cycle of locusts that follows that finally gave out. Given the pattern of what creates a locust swarm that would strip a country of vegetation, these are people who had endured a drought and then a locust plague. When the drought finally ended, the locusts came and destroyed everything again. The devastation lasted for a long time. Most likely, these are the locusts like those in Kenya last year, a desert swarm, ravenous and destroying everything. When you put all that together, the people to whom Joel was preaching had likely lost loved ones to starvation. They were probably hungry themselves. They were trying to feed their animals and couldn't find grazing land for them, losing the herds they had as well. Will I have food to eat? Had been a question they had been living with for a long time. By the time we get to the 2nd chapter of Joel, the part that Peter quotes, God is promising through the prophet Joel that the hard times are over. The drought, the locusts, the horrible season is over and something good is finally coming. There's restoration and new abundance, and things are feeling good again. Now, if you're thinking that story sounds familiar, it is. The prophets of the Bible tend to be called when things are difficult. They mostly show up to speak God's words to people who have endured extraordinary tragedies or are in the midst of them. And then when things are good, there seem to not be quite so many prophets, or at least nobody wrote down their words. And eventually the people might languish for a while and struggle as they wait for a new prophet. It's not surprising that Peter quotes Joel. Old Testament quotes show up in the New Testament a lot. And it's helpful to think of them like hyperlinks, not just quotes. They're a part of a text, but they point you to something else. You can go and check out that thing if you want to. The early church didn't just hear the words that Peter quoted. It was expected they knew the larger story. They knew about those locusts and the devastation experienced. They knew that locusts come after a drought. They heard far more than Peter said. The followers who were still around even in these resurrection times had been through devastation on their own. Even as this story comes, we're in the whirlwind of Holy Week. Jesus remained on earth 40 days after the resurrection. Within 6 weeks, this group had been through an arrest, a trial, crucifixion, death, resurrection, and ascension. Whiplash is putting it mildly. They have been through a little bit of everything. The words of Joel are more than just an explanation of what's happening. They evoke a promise of what will be that has long been written on the people's hearts. Peter is naming the promise of resurrection all over again because it turns out when you go through something horrible, it takes a while for you to believe the good news is real. And it's real. They are entering a time of abundance, a time of hope, and a time of prophets. Remember, in God's story, prophets arise to lead the people out of the devastating time into what will be. This time, though, they will all be prophets. In Peter's sermon that follows this reading, we hear the first promise that with baptism comes the gift of the Spirit. As time goes on, it becomes clear that the Spirit does what it will and comes to plenty of people before baptism. That gift is promised to every believer in the church, not just a few called to lead. For us, that remains one of the most assuring promises of our life together. There are traditions that name themselves as Spirit-filled in a different way than we do. We don't expect to handle snakes or speak languages we've never learned as part of our worship. Others do. In fact, churches that practice snake handling often have a line painted on the sanctuary floor, and if you cross it, you get a snake handed to you. I don't think we're trying that anytime soon. There's a long list of experiences we do not expect that are associated with the presence of the Spirit. But those are only some ways the Spirit can show up, not the only way the Spirit shows up. Maybe these flames that appeared over each person's head have plenty to teach us about what to expect from the Spirit. We have heard this story and we've been told to think of fire as wild and untamed. When we give an acolyte a candle lighter, we're reminded of that possibility. But fire is also candlelight and campfires and fireplaces and gas stoves. We invite fire into our lives for warmth, for beauty, for nourishment, for comfort, for restoration. We invite fire for many reasons. On Pentecost, the Spirit became always with us. We're not waiting, we're not hoping she shows up, always with us. And so trusting that she is here among us, we look for the possibilities she could bring. And as we look at the possibilities, we trust that she is there with us, and wherever we go with her. Amen.